Hello and welcome to another modelling video. This is Alan from the模系人生at YouTube with another paint tutorial. Today we are going to be looking at Alchemy paints. A bunch of samples have been sent to me by YDK-Studios, who seem to be distributing them in Australia through a blog and a series of tests performed. From a little bit of digging around and some research, it appears to be a relabeled brand called Zurc, which is manufactured in China and practically is classified as a organic lacquer. Generally the same thing that you use on cars and what's known as industrial applications. Unlike popular belief, they do not melt plastic or cause any issues. They, however, do tend to be a more hot paint, a stronger solvent that could cause some issues. We'll talk about that later. Paint is a paint, depending on how it's mixed and bottled, depends on how easy it is to use, though most people are generally drawn to the actual colour, and if it's thickened for hand application or thinned for airbrushing. Most airbrushable lacquers practically behave the same as according to what is standardised in the automotive industry or what's already set in the hobby either by Alclad or Mr. Hobby. I was curiously drawn to this paint due to the marketing raising this up on a pedestal as a miracle product, and found some of the tests committed were a bit misleading and dishonest, especially side by side using it with other paints and expecting it to dry quite quickly for the sole purpose of masking and no application of a primer. During this video we'll put this product to a test from another point of view and see what we come up with. It should be noted, testing water-soluble paints, enamels, as well as airbrushable lacquers on an unprimed surface is generally improper use, and immediately masking within 20 minutes is a fairly unrealistic objective. As we are unable to compare price and availability, as this was a sample concept a good 6 months ago and release not too well known yet, these are contained pre-mixed in 100ml bottles and 50ml bottles. I'm sampling the silver, dark grey and yellow. Upon request, an MSDS and other import-export documents could not be brought forward, so that has me a bit concerned about the makeup mix, as well as if there will be a potential availability. The tests conducted is going to be a masking with a Tamiya primed and bare plastic surface, the three colours on a primed surface, the silver on gloss black lacquer, and a pigment density test with the yellow across bare plastic, prime grey and black. Being pre-mixed, the paints are used directly out of the jar. Ball bearings were added into the bottles opposed to stirring it for a superior mix. Cracking open the bottle, I was able to see the consistency as well as the pigment for the metallic. Seems to be quite smooth, clings to the walls nicely, and is just the right consistency comparable to milk. Paint sprayed fairly smoothly out of a perfectly clean 0.3mm airbrush at approximately 11 to 13 psi. The first I sprayed was silver over gloss black, cleaned very nicely and automatically self-leveled and polished up quite well to my surprise. Had quite a bit of a sheen even after it dried. I did a double wet coat. Even though the underlayers were only applied within an hour, the thinner and paint combination was not too hot to disturb it or reactivate the paint underneath. Next we went straight for the yellow and grey on a primed surface. Again, applied as smooth as butter, no complaints, pretty easy to use straight out of the jar. However, I did notice that one of the selling points was how quick it dried to the touch. Doing double wet coats left a bit of a sheen and the appearance of being wet and in a soft putty state for well over 10 minutes, opposed to being able to mask immediately. I think that needs to be mentioned, that it's appropriate for a matte coat to dust it on, but for a gloss coat more time should be allocated for drying and maturation before masking should be attempted. For the masking tape, about an hour was allowed for the primer to be applied and dried. Tamiya was used thinned 50-50. The Alchemy paint was applied double wet and allowed approximately 2 hours to dry and harden. To a firm touch, a fingerprint or any evidence of a chemical change process seems to have mostly occurred and would be ready for tape to be applied. I used U-Star masking tape, which is pretty much on the same paring as Tamiya's product. It was all I had on hand. Applied the grey on top to see if any bleeding would occur. After an hour of that being added to see if any residue would stick to the tape, it was peeled back and seemed to be quite a smooth finish. Did not disturb, tear up the finish or leave behind any sorts of texture or anything behind on the tape. This is truly a pretty good product to mask with, both primed and unprimed. I did notice that the tests were heavily geared against the already Australian release SMS paints, and that seemed to have fared the worst in the masking tests, which is contrary to the ones I've done a little while ago. Where this paint did, however, disappoint me the most was in its pigment density, which isn't too much of a big deal. It seems to be fairly the same consistency as other pre-made airbrushable paints and some of the acrylics like Tamiya and whatnot, so industry standard. It is true that the product does have the chemical heat to latch onto a plastic surface, however is quite smooth. When going back to the yellow bit painted on the shield, the unprimed sections seem to show the paint sliding off the edges and the high points, thus looking a bit thin and quite uneven. On a primed surface, every surface it touched, it virtually stuck on quite nicely. Studying the leg with the white, grey and black lines, you can see that with a double wet coat, the very end is substantially darker to the white end, which is a bit transparent in some points, and the middle being ever so slightly darker in tone. Primer is definitely a must for colour balance with this product. I think surface durability should have been one of the big selling points to it. After 24 hours, scratching it with my nail, I did not see any finish damage on prime and unprimed, and it took until a knife digging into the material until the paint could be lifted. The paint does also seem to have some chemical resistance, which is very good for very hot application of heavy wet coats of paint going on top. This should be considered if you do need to strip paint. It will be a little more challenging. The paint is not as harsh on the nose while airbrushing, though the normal precautions should always be taken with lacquers of doing it outside or a very well ventilated area away from living quarters, full respirator, extractor booth, all that sort of jazz. The smell is quite unusual, and the pigment does seem to separate from the theatre and binder quite quickly. Rapid shaking, or at least the jet bubble in your airbrush, is definitely required. There are a few chemicals lurking around that I am unfamiliar with and cannot really conclude on, so definitely practice safety while handling this unknown product. Besides being disappointed with the approach of the marketing and information given until I was able to test it and play with it for myself, I'm fairly impressed and surprised with this product. It's not too bad. The colour range does seem to be a little bit limited to being colour matched to Gundam models, sci-fi and primary colours. Doesn't heavily go into military or other specialty product. It would be good to stock up on your major regularly used colours such as your black, whites, yellows and primaries. Really liked the silver. I do see myself buying more metallics, though generally how the price spins out on, I'm not too sure if I'll stick around with it or not. Generally, I'm not really afraid to mix my own colours, though finding expertly paletted mixed paints, particularly for a project or designing something together, is enjoyable, especially with shading and blending, to the reason why, unless the colour range extensively expands or goes in a very specialty or isolated area, I'm not going to be too focused on this brand. What I do reckon is it will be fairly good for people who are new with airbrushing due to its ease, if the product is accessible to you. This concludes the review. Thank you very much for watching. As always, until next time, stay tuned for further content. There is a lot of lesser known paint brands out there, and slowly, one by one, I'll track them down and try them out. We'll get some other Zurc colours just to do a quick check that these are the same product in the future. Catch you guys next time.